Welcome to Politipeeps. My name is Edward Hofer, and I'm here talking with Dr. Mary Ruwart. Dr. Ruwart, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing just fine, Ed. I hope you are too.
Oh, it's a beautiful day. It's a little cold up here, but otherwise, everything's just fine. Today, I'd like to talk about one of the more human issues facing society today. In order to reduce poverty, we've instituted a minimum wage. But since the institution of the minimum wage, poverty is still a problem. What would you do to address poverty?
Well, of course, you need to know the cause of poverty before you can really address it. And today, believe it or not, it's government regulation that is mostly responsible for poverty in the world today. And I'll give you an example of that because most people just haven't even thought of that concept before. But I think John Stossel did us all a favor by doing a study where he tried to open a Frisbee business in Hong Kong, New York City, and India. In Hong Kong, it took a few hours to get the license to sell Frisbees. In New York City, it took weeks. But in India, he was told it would take at least 5 years, and there was no guarantee that at the end of the process, he would be able to sell Frisbees. Now, if you think about it for a moment and recognize that in addition to the time cost of getting a license to sell things, there's also a monetary cost, and that the monetary cost more or less parallels the time cost. So what ends up happening is that if you are a poor person and you want to create some wealth so that your family can eat, you can't wait 5 years to get a license. That's impossible. So in India, a lot, and other, really, not just India, but most third world countries, most of the economy is in the black market because people can't wait to be legal. And so in New York City, that's less common, but there's still some black market activity there. But in Hong Kong, very little because it's so easy to be legal and doesn't cost very much either. Now, here in the US, what's happened is, of course, Democrats and Republicans keep creating more regulations. And who comes to their aid? The libertarians. The Institute for Justice, a group of libertarian litigators, takes on these regulations pro bono. And most of the people they represent are poor people. They're people of color just trying to scrape by. One of their first cases was African-American hair braiders. And what they did is, they would braid people's hair. But the people who had cosmetology license in many states insisted that these braiders have cosmetology license too, even though the courses never taught anything about braiding. In fact, the few braiders that went and tried to take these courses were expected to teach their fellow students how to braid, which was really an insult. So, it's about a year's training and $5,000 in a kind of average on the states. So this is ridiculous. And the Institute for Justice fought in many states and won the right for African-American hair braiders to do their thing, which I think is fantastic. And before Uber, Institute for Justice was fighting the regulations that allowed anyone trying to enter the limousine market to be evaluated by their coming competitors. In other words, people who are already established could tell the city government, don't give them a license. We don't need that. We're taking care of everything here. We don't need that competition. So the limo drivers weren't able to get their licenses. Well, Institute for Justice went and fought and won for them. And Institute for Justice is the group that took eminent domain to the Supreme Court. Now, granted, they lost there, but that didn't stop them. They've gone state by state to roll back just the instances in which a state or local government is allowed to use eminent domain. So there's been some progress. Now, why did I talk about this when you asked me about minimum wage? Well, I had to start there because I needed to explain how poverty is created in the world today. And in the third world, of course, they don't have the economic freedoms that we have here. And so they've never really joined, for the most part, the developed nations. And it's because the regulations are so egregious that they just can't get ahead. They can't create wealth. Now, let's go to the minimum wage, which has been proposed as a solution to this problem. But it's another regulation, and it really stops, especially the poor and uneducated and disabled, from getting that first job.
Before we go too far into the minimum wage, can we backtrack a little bit and talk about the Institute for Justice? Can you tell our viewers what the Institute of Justice is, where it came from, and what their main goal is?
Yes. Well, as I said, they're libertarian litigators or lawyers. A couple attorneys decided that they would establish this pro bono nonprofit group to help people, just as I've described, to help them get out of those regulations that were keeping them from joining the working class. And they've been very successful in that. And I'll give out their website because I think it's important that people know that. It's ij.org, very simple. And they've done so many different things. I mean, I could probably spend a whole hour talking about them, but one thing, because I'm living in Texas, that kind of relates to this minimum wage thing a little bit, is that they took on a case here in Texas. The adoption agencies, both state and federal, tend to discourage adoption of interracial adoption, I should say. So, for example, there were Black children that were not able to be adopted by white parents. And one set of parents in Texas said, this isn't right. And of course it isn't right, because if you want to stop discrimination, you intermarry the races and you adopt, interracial adoption. The Romans knew this when they conquered territories. That's what they did. They married the widows and adopted the children because they knew that that would integrate society. And we didn't allow that for many years because government didn't allow that. And the Institute for Justice fought that. And now interracial adoption is the norm rather than the exception. So it's really helped with discrimination. And I wanted to bring that up because minimum wage is actually very discriminatory. And I want to talk about that when we're ready.
Yes. So the Institute of Justice is a non-government organization that offers free legal services for no fee to people who feel they're being oppressed.
That's right. And they're libertarians. And I can proudly say I've contributed to them from the start.
Well, they sound like a great place to contribute and to work with.
Yes.
And so about the minimum wage then?
Yes. So in the minimum wage, Black economist Walter Williams, who's a libertarian, has said that the minimum wage is the most discriminatory law on the books. It looks colorblind, but it isn't. And I can tell you some stories. So, for example, I was rehabbing some low-income housing apartments that had been condemned. And of course, the work site had a fair amount of clutter around it, as, a lot of things were going on. And a young gentleman who lived down the street came to me and said, I'd like to work for you. He said, and I know, I'm disabled. I live in this home down the street, but I think I could do a good job for you. And I'll work for $2 an hour. And then if you like what I do, you can give me a raise. Or if you can't give me a raise, give me a recommendation, because I want to get in the workforce. I don't want to just sit at the house all day. And I can walk to work, so I don't even need transportation. He was all excited. And I wanted to hire him. But again, I was young and naive at the time. And I was afraid that if I did that I get zapped for ignoring the minimum wage, which at the time was about $3.50 in Michigan. And of course, I knew I could if I hired somebody who was fully capable at minimum wage, I'd be sure at least of what I was getting, whereas with him, I wasn't totally sure. I would have been happy to hire him. And I write good recommendations, so I knew I could do well by him, but the law kept me from doing that. And the same thing happens with women not so much today, but back when I was getting started with women and minorities, because back then, the way that you got your foot in the door when people discriminated against you was you offered to work at a lower wage. Now, it's not a good thing that, that had to happen, but the good thing about it was once you got your foot in the door and proved yourself, you either got a raise or you went to somebody else, because now, you had experience, which is what you needed, right? So unfortunately, many of our minority children and teens don't have work experience, and they don't have the skills that sometimes people in wealthier neighborhoods have. And so that's what they used to get their foot in the door. Well, minimum wage stopped all that. So, if you didn't have enough skill to be worth the minimum wage, you couldn't get paid to train. In other words, you had to pay to train. And I experienced this myself when I went first year of college. I was paid a few bucks below minimum wage to work in a lab, which is great because when you're doing laboratory work, as you well know, Ed, it takes about a year to really get used to the rhythm of it and not overplan your experiments. And so this was so valuable to me. But then the following year, my job was covered by minimum wage. Now, if I wanted to work in the lab, I had to cough up tuition for, what they called independent study to do the same thing I was doing and getting paid for before.
Well, when I did my internship, that's exactly what happened. I had to pay for 9 months to go work in labs instead of actually getting paid. And if it hadn't been for the minimum wage, they likely would have paid me just a very little bit. But that I would have done it for nothing.
Exactly.
Instead, I had to pay for it, and I had to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for it.
Yes.
It was really awful.
Yes. Well, yes. And when I was working at Upjohn, we would bring in students from the colleges in their senior year. They would come and work in the lab and write a thesis, because the college they went to was a really demanding college. And we were happy to do that. We didn't get paid for it or anything, it was fine. Well, then it turned out those internships, or whatever you want to call them, became covered by the minimum wage. And then we had to pay them to come in, which was, another cost to us, because just bringing them in the laboratory and giving them supplies and animals, was costly. But we did it because, we felt it was a great thing to do. But then when the minimum wage hit on top of that, and all, of course, the benefits that are demanded when you're employing someone instead of kind of giving them this gift of an internship, it just got so unwieldy that we couldn't take many students anymore. It's really sad. So in other words, and I want to say studies support this. The studies always support this. If you look at, for example, Black teenage unemployment, it goes down as the number of jobs covered by minimum wage go up. It's an exact reflection. So it's really hurt on our minorities and disadvantaged and disabled most of all. It's so sad. And so it's the difference between having a low-paying job and no job at all, and no experience at all. Because if you can't get in on that first rung of the ladder and get that first job, you can't get the job experience and the training that you need to go higher. And it's really been a disaster.
So your opinion is that the minimum wage has made poverty worse?
Yes, and that's why, as you started out when we talked, why hasn't poverty gotten better? And that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that we have welfare programs that encourage young people, especially minorities, to make really bad financial decisions in their teenage years. For example, when I rented to low-income people, many of my tenants were welfare recipients. And it's interesting. I had always thought that these welfare recipients were disabled in some way. Well, that was true for maybe 5 to 10% of the tenants that I had. Most were able-bodied. And the most common type of person that I would have would be a teenager who got pregnant in high school and came to me and said, hey, when I have this baby, I'm going to get a welfare check, so I'm going to establish my own household, so I'm putting in my application now. And of course, when this young woman quit high school to have the baby, got the welfare check, which seems big in high school, and then found out how much it really costs to have a child, she went, this isn't going to work. So she had a second child and then a third child, because her stipend would go up to the third child, so that she could get enough money to live on. But even so, it wasn't enough, right? So she's going, wait a minute, I'm always going to be poor. I'm never even going to be able to afford a car. So this revelation happens about 21, and she wants to go back to work, but now she's got 3 children that need childcare. She doesn't have a high school diploma. She goes out there and tries to get a job, which, you know, is a low-level job that does not have childcare, and of course she can't do it because most of these entry-level jobs don't have childcare. So unless she had a relative that was willing to take the children while she worked, she was trapped forever in you know, a welfare situation. Now, if she did have a relative who would help her, then it took her about 2 to 3 years to become part of the really a steady working class person. And I even had one tenant who told me, hey, you know, Mary, I really like you, so I want to give you some advice if you don't mind. You know, you work at Upjohn all day, you work at the apartments at night, you need to have children get on welfare and get a life.
And somebody gave you that as career advice?
Yes, a welfare recipient, one of my tenants who liked me. And this wasn't uncommon. There was a couple that told me, yeah, they had figured it out and they'd rather be poor and have the time, you know, than go to work. So the problem is most of the welfare tenants, I should point out, fell into the category of having left high school to have a child. And the father of the child could not live with them because if he did, the lady wouldn't get welfare. So there was no, you know, it really disrupted the bonding of people in marriage. And all of this was known before the welfare program started. They did little pilot studies with welfare programs and found out this was exactly what was going to happen. So this was not accidental. And you know, so the Black poverty rate was going down before welfare, and it plateaued when the welfare program started. And that's one of the reasons.
Oh, that is very interesting. So how can people find you online if they want to know more about you?
They can go to my website at ruwart.com, ruwart.com, and there they can not only find articles, and they can go in my free library and actually read the 1993 edition of Healing Our World, and they can, on the home page, go to the lower right-hand corner and see all the connections to my social media.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And again, this is PolitiPeeps, so please like, share, and subscribe, and come back often for more content.